Blessed is our God at all times, both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Christ is risen.
Indeed he is risen.
Welcome back, Father Sebastian, all of our participants here as we continue on in the Paschal season now, considering the text for the Sunday of the Paralytic, which has all the themes of resurrection running through it, of healing, of the giving of life, but also underneath, or say a little bit behind the scenes setback, is this theme of isolation, of sin, and the result of that. And I have a really insightful quotation to share from Father Alexander Schmemann on this gospel. Let's take a look here at these biblical texts. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. And Acts chapter 9, verse 32 through 42. 9:32 through 42. So let's start here with the gospel text of John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15, the story of the healing of the paralytic. At that time, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the pool of the sheep, a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these were lying a great multitude of the sick, blind, lame, and those with shriveled limbs, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel of the Lord used to come down at certain times into the pool, and the water was stirred. And the first to go down into the pool after the stirring of the water was cured of whatever infirmity he had. Now a certain man was there who had been 38 years under his infirmity. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been in this state a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred, for while I am coming, another steps down before me." And Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your pallet and walk." And at once the man was cured. And he took up his pallet and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him, who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. You are not allowed to take up the pallet." And he answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" And they asked him then, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" But the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away, since there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you are cured. Sin no more, lest something worse happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Father, first of all, as we're opening the gospel here to chapter 5 of John, just lay out for us the location of this particular healing in the context of the gospel.
So, yeah, the location is in Jerusalem, and it's just north of the temple. It was a place that was back then held to be a place where there was healing power in this water. They used the water there for the usage in the temple. The place, in fact, called Bethesda, although there's variants of the name in the manuscripts. Bethesda from the Hebrew Beit Chesed, so house of mercy. This is the Aramaic form, though. So the people understood this as a place that God was in some special way blessing those who were in need.
John, in his gospel, focuses particularly on the healings of Jesus that happen on the Sabbath day. In fact, in John, it becomes this real point of contention with the Jews, that Jesus keeps healing on the Sabbath day and healing on the Sabbath day and healing on the Sabbath day. And as it says regarding the healing of the blind man, I believe that it was one of the points, the tipping points in which they began to actually seek to kill him. Why is it that Jesus is healing on the Sabbath day, that John is particularly focused on that in the Gospel of John? And why is it such a point of contention here? You would think, here this guy, 38 years he can't walk. He's probably known in the area for his illness. People have been rejoicing, but no, not at all. They're like, "No, you can't carry your pallet, sorry."
So there's a lot going on here. At the first level, is this image of, like you said, this guy, 38 years. That should remind us of the book of Deuteronomy, of the people of Israel wandering in the wilderness. The Gospel of John shows us that Jesus is the new Moses, or the prophet like Moses who is to come. This is a major theme throughout. And so this is why the Gospel of John refers to Jesus's great works not as miracles, but as signs. And the signs, that language should remind us again of the story of Israel and Moses, where Moses worked these great signs to bring about, intending to bring about the belief in the people. The signs that Moses works, if we look at the Exodus story very carefully, those plagues that keep coming, they're coming once a week, probably on the Sabbath, though it's not crystal clear on what day but it's a weekly occurrence. Again, in that Jewish context, probably expecting to be a Sabbath occurrence. So it's the Sabbath healings, the Sabbath signs that Jesus is working here are mosaic images. Jesus is that fulfillment.
I want to share with our participants, just to give a little bit more context, or say a little more of physical representation while we're talking about this. Some pictures here. I think you can see that, right, Father Sebastian?
Yes.
Of the pool of Bethesda, and you can see it now built over very much with, medieval construction, Renaissance construction, and so forth, and archways of various levels of churches that were built over the site. This location is quite well known to our Melkite community in Jerusalem because it was the location of our seminary. The seminary is literally 15 feet away from this spot. Of course, it was taken from us, and we no longer have it, unfortunately. But you can see down in the lower areas of that archaeological dig, there's still pools of water that gather there. Most of the place is dry, but nevertheless, you can still visit that today. So that's a nice, I hope, a little help to our participants as you're considering this beautiful story. There's a couple of themes here that kind of weave together, not only focused upon the healing, but also the state of this man. A lot of the healings in the Gospel of John give kind of physical representation to sin. John is trying very much to show what happens, not to say that because you sin, suddenly you become a paralytic. No, but that there's a problem, and that is that when we fall into sin, we become, in a sense, like a paralytic. We are unable to walk with God. Jesus' healings are not so much about making the person walk again. He does that. But more importantly, about that he's able to walk with Jesus. He's able to follow him and come to know him. And this is very much true of this situation here. Interesting that it says toward the end of this gospel that there was a crowd in that place. There was a crowd in the place. And here, this guy has been ill for 38 years, surrounded by people. And when Jesus asked him the question, by the way, the fathers of the church focus on this thing. He said, well, Jesus, it says right here, Jesus knew the guy was ill. He saw him lying there. He knew that he had been in that state for a long time. And yet he says, do you want to get well? And the church fathers here focus upon this question to say, it's not because Jesus didn't know that the guy wanted to get well. Obviously, the guy wants to get well. It's almost a ridiculous question. But no, that the Lord is kind of calling out this desire and focusing this man's attention upon the one who can heal him. And he does this with us oftentimes to allow us to become, in a sense, hungry for him, hungry for healing, to allow that desire to kind of well up in us. But very interesting. There's a crowd of people, and the sick man answered, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the water." So while the man is surrounded by people, he's very much isolated. There's no one there for him. And I mentioned Father Alexander Schmemann. I have a beautiful quotation here from him in which he basically says, look, sin isolates us. Selfishness isolates us. And when we have this attitude of kind of a me-firstness or a selfishness to life, that I want to get ahead, as all of these people crowded in this area were living, then we become so isolated to one another that we, in some sense, cease to exist. That this whole crowd of people ceased to exist for this guy. There was no one there for him. So this is what Father Schmemann says. He says, "This is truly the cry of someone who has come to know the terrible power of human selfishness, of isolation, of narcissism. Is this? There's no one there for me." I was mentioning the church fathers, and here's that beautiful quotation from St. Athanasius. He says, "Let them know that the Lord came not to make a display, but to heal and teach those who were suffering. For the way of the one aiming to display would be just to appear and to dazzle those around him, but for the one seeking to heal and teach, the way is not simply to appear here and there, but to give himself to the help of those in need." And Jesus goes and makes himself present in this place that is, you can imagine what it must have been like, this pool of healing that on occasion would be possible for someone to be healed. It must have been a place that was horrible. The stench of open wounds, of the cry of the sick in this place. And Jesus intentionally goes there and makes himself present, and then meets this man face to face. It's during this time period, and we're going to look at this in the epistle here. During this time period, the church places before us the model of the early church, which is modeled in the life of Christ. And then it asks us as a church to reflect upon that icon of the vibrant church, the healing church, the church which is given new life, the church which now makes people to walk again with God as this paralytic, as we are in the bath of holy baptism. Before we look at the epistle, this theme of baptism now it just becomes present every single Sunday for us in every single gospel, with a particular twist for the catechumen. And that twist is that the waters themselves are not the source of healing, but it is Jesus who grants to the created order the possibility of the communication of his divine life. As we're going to see here in a minute, it's not Peter who heals. It is Jesus who heals through Peter. It is not the waters of baptism that have given new life to the catechumen. It is Christ who works through these things. And this is the model or the icon that we're given now in these weeks following Pascha, in which we see the restoration of creation, and the church focuses our attention on that. Let's take a look here at the epistle in Acts chapter 9, verse 32 through 42. Acts chapter 9, verse 32 through 42. "In those days it came to pass that Peter, while visiting all of them, came to the saints living at Lydda, and he found there a certain man named Aeneas, who had been lying in bed for 8 years, since he was a paralytic. And Peter said to him, 'Aeneas, Jesus Christ is healing you. Get up and make your bed.' And he got up immediately, and all of the inhabitants of Lydda and the plain of Sharon saw him, and they were converted to the Lord. Now in Joppa there was a certain woman disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas, and she devoted herself to good works and almsgiving. But it happened at that time that she fell ill and died, and they washed her and laid her in an upper room. And since Lydda is close to Joppa, the disciples, hearing Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with the request, 'Come to us without delay.' And Peter got up and went with them, and on his arrival they led him to the upper room. And all the widows stood around him weeping, showing him the gowns and cloaks Dorcas used to make for them. But Peter, putting them all out, knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, 'Tabitha, get up.' She opened her eyes, saw Peter, and sat up. Then Peter gave her his hand and raised her up, and called the saints and the widows. He gave her back to them alive. And it became known all over Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Father, please, as we usually do, give us the context of this text here in Acts chapter 9.
The book of Acts is the record of the spread of the gospel from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. And that's what Jesus says to the disciples in chapter 1, verse 8. He says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And so we're right now at this point in the previous chapter, in chapter 8, Samaria had been converted. So there was Jerusalem, Judea, and then now Samaria. And then now we're just before we're getting to the ends of the earth. That is the story of Cornelius, when all of a sudden the gospel is going to begin to spread to the Gentiles. And so here Peter, after having, with the other apostles, spread the gospel in that region, goes to the coast. And so this is Joppa, or Joppa is this is modern day Jaffa. And it is a little coastal city, at that time a Jewish fishing village, just south of Caesarea. And so he goes to this region, to this first to Lydda, which is a little more inland, and then Joppa, and he heals these people here in these places.
You know, we heard this is not the first time we're seeing the healing of Peter and the apostles in their ministry now in the early church. We saw also that the sick were brought out into the streets, and the shadow of the apostles would fall on them and they would be healed. I mentioned just earlier about this image, or this, how the church places before us the early church as kind of this icon to see how we're living up to this truth, and to remind us of one fundamentally important truth, and that is what is the result of baptism. The catechumen, now having gone through the waters of baptism, all of us, in a sense, having been enjoyed this gift of new life in the resurrection, are called to remember now the effects of this communion with God, that the healing which we hear about in the Gospel of chapter 5, the healing of the paralytic, is not for Jesus alone, this healing ministry, but it is now extended to all of us who have been baptized into him, who have become a partaker in his ministry. And we see that now in these two healings in the epistle. But as I mentioned before, is Peter said to Aeneas, Jesus Christ is healing you. And I think it's a fundamentally important thing to remember here in our ministry in the church, that it is Christ who works in and through us. He says, "I will remain with you always." And those aren't just, Bible words and nice words of Jesus, but he does truly, physically remain with us always in his church. And I say physically, it's important because our incarnation, like the resurrection, is not for Jesus alone. It is the great mystery of God that he now extends this gift to all of those who have been baptized into him, that we might be truly his hands and his feet to continue on that work of God, which is the giving of life, which is the incarnation of love. This is the ministry of the church, whether it be the bread on the altar, the holy chrism, the water in the baptismal font, each one of us extending our hands to those who are in need. This is the work of Jesus Christ by which the divinization of the world takes place again, because this is God's original plan in paradise. Paradise is now restored, and the church now goes about continuing this restoration, in a sense, tilling and keeping the garden of the Lord until it begins to grow and bear fruit again in the lives, not of just only of the plants out in the field, but of the people who are in the vineyard of the Lord, these people that are being healed here in the gospel. It is important that we avail ourselves to this healing. We bring ourselves to be healed, and we respond to the Lord. Yes, it is. I've been waiting, and yes, I want to be healed of the sin which has made me, in a sense, a paralytic, who finds me now, places me on my deathbed, and I want to be healed of this, and therefore to come not only to the fount of holy baptism, but also of holy confession, as we heard in the gospel text just recently. Jesus breathed on the apostles, and now the apostles are given this gift of God's life for the healing ministry to bring people back into communion with God. To Christ our God be glory both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Christ is risen.
Indeed he is risen.
Heaven rejoice, and all on earth be glad. For the Lord has exerted power with his arm. By death he has trampled upon death, and has become